The air in the boardroom on the 95th floor of Vance Tower was worth more per cubic foot than the real estate in most major cities. It was filtered, chilled to a precise 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and silent, save for the controlled, confident murmur of Alistair Vance's voice as he walked his board members through the final stages of the Atlas acquisition. It was a hostile takeover, a corporate blitzkrieg he had orchestrated with the precision of a master strategist, and it would cement his legacy as a titan, not merely a successor. The final signatory pen, a Mont Blanc forged from the melted-down hull of a decommissioned spy plane, lay waiting on the polished obsidian table. It was a $50 million exclamation point on a $10 billion sentence. He was mid-syllable, outlining the asset liquidation strategy, when a flicker of movement at the edge of the vast floor-to-ceiling glass doors caught his eye. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 7, with enormous dark eyes and tangled black hair, was standing there, clutching a teddy bear whose fur was worn down to the nubbin. She wore a faded pink t-shirt and jeans with a hole in one knee. She was an anomaly, a glitch in the sterile perfection of his world. Security should have intercepted her floors below. Before anyone could react, she slipped through the gap in the doors, her small, worn sneakers making no sound on the Italian marble. She walked directly, unhesitatingly, toward him, ignoring the stunned faces of the most powerful men and women in the city. She stopped just before the table, her head barely clearing its surface, and looked up at him. Her gaze was not one of awe or fear, but of simple, unnerving knowing. She raised a small hand, beckoning him closer. Alistair, against every instinct, leaned down, the scent of lavender-infused wool from his bespoke suit mingling with the faint, incongruous smell of playground dust and cheap soap. She cupped her hand around his ear and whispered, her voice a tiny, clear bell in the cathedral-like silence. Starlight and rust. Alistair Vance froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving a mask of chalk-white shock. The half-spoken word on his lips died. The Mont Blanc pen, forgotten, was a dead weight in his hand. Every meticulously constructed facade, every wall of ambition and ruthless logic he had built around himself for 2 decades, vaporized in an instant. The room, the deal, the $10 billion. It all ceased to exist. There was only the echo of those 3 impossible words. A password. A ghost. A key to a lock he hadn't thought about in 25 years, spoken by a child who shouldn't exist. The silence in the room stretched, taut and fragile, before shattering into a cacophony of confused murmurs and scraping chairs. Alistair barely registered it. He was falling, tumbling back through time, the sterile boardroom dissolving into the memory of a cold, metallic floor and the scent of oil and decay. He saw his father's hands, calloused and grease-stained, typing on an old beige IBM keyboard. He heard his father's voice, a low rumble of quiet enthusiasm. "This will be our secret, Allie. Just between us. For the important stuff." What was the important stuff? Alistair couldn't remember. He'd been 12, more interested in the new Super Nintendo his mother had promised him than in his father's failing factory and the clunky computer that sat in its dusty, forgotten office. "What do you see when you look up through the skylight, son?" his father had asked, pointing a grimy finger toward a grime-covered pane of glass in the corrugated metal roof. Young Alistair had squinted. "Stars, I guess. Starlight." His father had smiled, a sad, tired thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. "And what do you smell all around us?" The boy had wrinkled his nose. "Rust." His father had nodded slowly, typing the words into the password field. Starlight and rust. The promise of the infinite heavens and the reality of earthly decay. The dreamer and the pragmatist. It was the perfect poetic summary of Arthur Vance, a man Alistair had spent his entire adult life trying not to be. Someone was shaking his shoulder. It was Richard Sterling, his COO, and the closest thing he had to a friend. "Alistair, are you all right? Who is this child?" Alistair blinked, the memory receding, leaving a cold hollowness in its wake. He looked down. The girl was still there, watching him with those same steady, unblinking eyes. The teddy bear was held tight against her chest like a shield. He straightened up, his movements stiff, robotic. He looked past the girl to the doorway where two frantic security guards were being held back by his personal assistant, a formidable woman named Evelyn who was gesturing wildly. "Lock down the floor." Alistair's voice was a raw rasp, unrecognizable to himself. "Nobody in or out. Get her." He pointed a trembling finger at the child. "Out of my sight. And find out how, in God's name, this happened." Evelyn nodded, her usual unflappable composure momentarily cracked, and moved to intercept the child. But as she approached, the little girl turned. Not to Evelyn, but back to Alistair. She said nothing more, just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something to herself. Then she allowed Evelyn to gently guide her away. Alistair stood rooted to the spot, the eyes of his board on him, their expressions a mixture of concern, annoyance, and predatory curiosity. They smelled blood in the water, a weakness. The Atlas deal, moments from completion, was now suspended in an agonizing limbo. He could feel the power dynamic in the room shifting with every second of his paralysis. He had to regain control. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "My apologies, ladies and gentlemen. A momentary indisposition. A security breach of an unforeseen nature." He forced his lips into a semblance of a smile, a chilling, humorless gesture. "We will reconvene in 1 hour. Please enjoy the refreshments in the lounge." He didn't wait for a response, turning on his heel and striding toward his private office, a vast, minimalist space with a panoramic view of the city he had conquered. He shut the door behind him, the heavy oak clicking shut with a sound of utter finality. He walked to the window, but he didn't see the sprawling metropolis below. He saw a rusted-out factory, a dusty computer, and his father's ghost. He had built his entire empire on a foundation of ruthless pragmatism, on the cold, hard logic of numbers. He had systematically dismantled everything his father had stood for: the loyalty to employees over profit, the handshake deals, the belief in community over corporate expansion. He had scorned his father's starlight and embraced the world of rust, believing it was the only reality. And now, a child, a nobody from nowhere, had whispered his father's secret into his ear, and the entire edifice of his life felt like it was about to crumble. He didn't know who she was, but he knew one thing with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. She was not a random security breach. She was a message, and he had to find out who sent it. An hour later, Alistair was sitting behind his desk, a sleek slab of chrome and recycled volcanic rock, when Evelyn entered without knocking. Her face was pale. In her hands, she held a tablet. "We have a name," she said, her voice low. "The girl is Lily. Her mother is Maria Flores. She's on the night cleaning crew for floors 80 through 95. Alistair's jaw tightened. A cleaner's daughter. The sheer banality of it was almost more insulting than a sophisticated corporate espionage plot. And how did she get into the most secure boardroom in the country during the most important meeting of the year? Evelyn swiped a finger across the tablet. It seems. She just walked. Security footage shows her following her mother into a service elevator. Maria was taking a short break to give her dinner. The girl must have slipped away. She walked through a catering corridor, past a preoccupied security detail setting up for the post-meeting reception. And then, she was at the boardroom door. No one stopped her. It's as if she was invisible. "Incompetence," Alistair spat. Fire the entire detail on this floor. Already done, sir. Evelyn anticipated his commands, as always. What about the mother, Maria Flores? She's being held in a security office downstairs. She's distraught. She says Lily is a quiet child, that she's never wandered off before. She has no idea what happened. Alistair leaned back, steepling his fingers. A quiet child who had never wandered off before just happened to wander into his boardroom and deliver a cryptic 25-year-old password. The odds were astronomical. It had to be a setup. A competitor. Someone had gotten to the cleaner. What do we know about Maria Flores? Been with the contractor for 3 years, clean record, single mother. Lives in the Ironwood district. The Ironwood district. The name landed like a punch to the gut. It was the decaying industrial neighborhood that surrounded his father's old factory. The place he had sworn he would never set foot in again. The very area his Atlas acquisition was slated to demolish to make way for a new, gleaming tech campus. The coincidence was too great, too specific. "Bring the mother here," he commanded, "and the child. I want to speak to them myself." Evelyn hesitated. "Sir, the board is waiting. Richard is trying to placate them, but they're growing restless. The Atlas representatives are threatening to walk." "Let them threaten," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is more important." Evelyn saw the look in his eyes, a glint of something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not ambition, but a raw, unsettling uncertainty. She nodded and left the room. While he waited, Alistair stared out the window at the city. From this height, it was an abstract map, a grid of lights and shadows. The people were insignificant ants. He had always found comfort in that perspective. It made the difficult decisions, the layoffs, the closures, the hostile takeovers, easier. They were just moves on a chessboard. But now, one of those insignificant ants had crawled all the way up to his throne and whispered a secret in his ear. He felt a tremor of the one emotion he had long since buried. Fear. Not fear of financial loss, but of the unknown. The door opened and Evelyn ushered in a woman and the little girl. Maria Flores was small and slender, with the same dark eyes as her daughter, though hers were wide with terror and exhaustion. She clutched Lily's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. The girl, Lily, seemed utterly unfazed. She looked around the opulent office with a placid curiosity, her gaze lingering on a piece of abstract metal sculpture in the corner before settling back on Alistair. "Mr. Vance," Maria began, her voice trembling, "I am so sorry. So sorry. I don't know what happened. She is a good girl. She never, please, don't fire me. This job. It is all we have." Alistair ignored her pleas, his attention fixed on the child. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He made his voice as gentle and non-threatening as he could manage, a tool he hadn't used in years. "Lily," he said, "that's your name, isn't it?" The girl nodded, her pigtails bouncing. "Lily, can you tell me something? The words you said to me earlier in the big room. Where did you hear them?" Lily looked at her mother, then back at Alistair. She shrugged a small shoulder. "They were a story." "A story?" Alistair pressed. "Who told you this story?" "Grandma Rosa," Lily said simply. Maria's head snapped up. "Mama, what does my mother have to do with this?" she asked, bewildered. "Your grandmother?" Alistair asked Lily, ignoring Maria. "Who is she?" "She's a star now," Lily said, pointing a finger toward the ceiling. "She went up to heaven last year." Alistair felt a surge of frustration. A dead end. This was getting more absurd by the second. A story from a dead grandmother. "Lily," he said, his patience fraying. "This is very important. I need you to think very hard. Did your grandma Rosa tell you to find me? Did she tell you to say those words to me?" Lily tilted her head, considering the question with a seriousness that was unnerving in a child so young. She said the words were a key. She said finally, "For the Sad King." "The Sad King?" Alistair repeated, baffled. "Who is the Sad King?" Lily looked at him, her expression one of profound and simple pity. "You are," she said. The air left Alistair's lungs. He felt as if the child had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. The Sad King. It was another ghost, another echo from the past. It was the name his father had jokingly called him when he was a boy, whenever he would get lost in a serious, melancholy mood. "You're the Sad King in the tall glass castle," his father would say, ruffling his hair. "Always thinking about serious things. You need to look at the stars more, Ali." Alistair stared at the child. This was impossible. Utterly. Logically. Fundamentally impossible. A random cleaner's daughter couldn't know these things. These weren't just secrets. They were relics, buried in the deepest, most sealed-off chambers of his memory. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the solid floor of his office had turned to sand. He looked at Maria Flores, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and utter confusion. "Your mother," Alistair said, his voice strained. "Rosa. What was her job? Where did she work?" Maria swallowed hard. She was a nurse, a palliative care nurse. For most of her life, she worked at the St. Jude's Hospice. St. Jude's Hospice. The name was vaguely familiar. Alistair's mind raced, connecting dots he didn't even know existed. He swiveled his chair to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up a private, encrypted file. It was his father's personal history. He scrolled down to the end, to the final months, the details of which he had outsourced to his assistants, too busy and too emotionally detached to handle them himself. And there it was, St. Jude's Hospice, the facility where Arthur Vance had spent the last 6 weeks of his life. The world tilted on its axis. Alistair felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. A nurse, his father, a story. It wasn't a corporate conspiracy. It was something far more intimate and, in a way, far more terrifying. It was the past, reaching out with ghostly fingers to reclaim him. He looked back at Maria and Lily. He saw them now not as a threat or a nuisance, but as emissaries from a world he had long since abandoned. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Evelyn," he called out, his voice hoarse. Evelyn, who had been standing discreetly by the door, entered immediately. "Cancel my afternoon," he said. "Postpone the Atlas vote indefinitely. Cite personal reasons." Evelyn's eyes widened, but she didn't question him. "And arrange for a car. I need to go somewhere." "Where to, sir?" "The Ironwood district," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at Maria. "I'm giving you the rest of the week off with pay. Go home. I will have someone contact you tomorrow. We need to talk further." Maria looked like she was about to faint from a combination of relief and confusion. She just nodded, pulling Lily closer. Alistair's gaze fell on the girl one last time. She was watching him, that same unnerving, ancient wisdom in her eyes. The Sad King. He turned away and walked toward the private elevator that would take him from his glass castle down to the gritty reality of the street. As the door slid shut, sealing him in the silent, descending box, he was alone with the ghosts of his father and the echoes of a child's whisper. The drive to the Ironwood district was like traveling to a foreign country. The gleaming skyscrapers and manicured parks of the city center gradually gave way to squat, brick warehouses, graffiti-scarred underpasses, and streets lined with struggling storefronts. The sky, once a brilliant, open blue, seemed to shrink, hemmed in by a tangle of power lines and the skeletal remains of smokestacks. This was the world his father had inhabited, the world he had fought and failed to save. The world Alistair had escaped. The car, a sleek black Maybach, was as out of place here as a spaceship. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of curiosity and resentment. Alistair watched them from behind the tinted glass, feeling like an alien observing a primitive species. Yet, there was a disquieting sense of familiarity to it all. The smell of diesel fumes and damp pavement. The particular shade of rust that seemed to stain everything. It was the scent and color of his childhood. He directed the driver to a specific address, a place he hadn't seen with his own eyes in over 20 years. Vance and Son Precision Tooling. The factory. It was still standing, though just barely. The chain-link fence was sagging and overgrown with weeds. The massive sign, once a proud declaration of his family's name, was faded and peeling, the letters barely legible. The windows were boarded up, and a large, weathered, "Condemned" sign was nailed to the main entrance. This was the heart of the area slated for demolition. In a few months, if his plan had proceeded, this monument to his father's failure would have been reduced to rubble. He had told himself it was a necessary act of progress, a clearing away of the old to make way for the new. But looking at it now, it felt more like a desecration, an act of patricide. He got out of the car, ignoring his driver's concerned look. The air was thick with the ghosts of industry. He walked to the fence, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft, unkempt earth. He gripped the cool, rusted metal, staring at the decaying building. He tried to feel the triumph he had always imagined, the vindication of having surpassed the man who had created this place. Instead, all he felt was a profound, aching emptiness. This wasn't just a building. It was a tomb. It held the memories of his father, not as the gentle, failing dreamer Alistair had painted him as, but as a man who had poured his heart and soul into something he believed in. A man who had known every one of his 100 employees by name, who had sponsored the local Little League team, who had kept the factory running at a loss for 2 years just to keep his workers employed through a recession. Alistair had dismissed it all as sentimentality, as poor business sense. Now he wasn't so sure. He thought of Lily, a key for the Sad King. What was he meant to unlock? He had assumed it was the computer, but maybe it was something more. Maybe it was this place. Maybe it was himself. He pulled out his phone and called Evelyn. "The Atlas acquisition," he said, his voice firm. "I want you to pull together every piece of data we have on the Ironwood district. Not just the property values and zoning laws. I want demographics. I want community impact studies. I want to know about the small businesses, the residents, the schools, everything." "Sir?" Evelyn sounded confused. "The plan is total demolition. That data is irrelevant." "It is not irrelevant," Alistair snapped. "Just do it, and one more thing. Find out everything you can about a nurse named Rosa Flores. I want to know every detail of her employment at St. Jude's, especially her patient assignments during the last year of her life." He hung up before she could reply. He had a key. Now he needed to find the lock. He stayed by the fence for a long time, the city noise fading into a distant hum. For the first time in his adult life, Alistair Vance wasn't looking forward, plotting his next conquest. He was looking back, into the starlight and the rust, and he was beginning to understand that he had been blind. Over the next few days, Alistair became a man possessed. The Atlas deal was left to wither on the vine, much to the fury of his board and the bewilderment of the financial world. Rumors flew that he was ill, that he was having a breakdown, that the pressure had finally cracked him. He ignored it all. His world had shrunk to 2 obsessions: his father's past and the Flores family. Evelyn's report started to come in, painting a picture that unsettled him more with each new detail. The Ironwood district wasn't just a collection of decaying properties. It was a community. A fragile, struggling, but fiercely proud community. It was home to families who had lived there for generations, who had worked in the factories that now stood silent. It had a community center, a soup kitchen run out of a church basement, and a network of neighbors who looked out for one another. His $10 billion tech campus would obliterate it all, displacing thousands of people with nowhere else to go. He read the personal stories, the interviews with residents, and saw not abstract data points but human lives. He saw the face of Maria Flores, a single mother fighting to keep a roof over her daughter's head, multiplied 1,000 times over. Simultaneously, the file on Rosa Flores grew. She had been a model nurse, beloved by patients and staff alike. And for the final 2 months of Arthur Vance's life, she had been his primary caregiver. Notes from other staff members mentioned how Arthur, often confused and lost in memories, would speak to Rosa for hours. He spoke of his regrets, of the business he had lost, but most of all, he spoke of his son. "He's a king now," one note quoted Arthur as saying. "A sad king in a tall glass castle. He's forgotten the starlight." Rosa had been there, a quiet, compassionate witness to his father's final, heartbreaking confessions. The pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see. His father, lonely and full of regret. A kind nurse who listened. A story passed from grandmother to grandchild. And a little girl with an impossible message. He knew he had to talk to Maria and Lily again, not as a billionaire interrogating a security risk, but as someone searching for an answer. He had a car sent for them, not to the intimidating fortress of Vance Tower, but to a small, private park he owned on the city's edge. It was a quiet, neutral space. When they arrived, Maria was still nervous, but less terrified than before. Lily, however, was unchanged, her calm curiosity a constant, unnerving presence. Alistair had dismissed his security, and the three of them sat on a bench near a duck pond. "Maria," Alistair began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "I need to ask you about your mother, and my father." He explained what he had learned, about Rosa being his father's nurse. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She never said, "My mother." She was very professional. She never talked about her patients by name. She used to come home very sad sometimes. She talked about a man who missed his son very much, a man who felt he had failed, who worried his son hated him. Alistair felt a familiar, sharp pang of guilt. He hadn't hated his father. Not really. He had been disappointed, frustrated, ashamed of his father's gentle nature in a world that rewarded predators. He had loved him, but he had never known how to show it. He had been too busy trying to be everything his father wasn't. "Did she ever tell you anything else?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Any stories?" Maria shook her head. "No, not to me. But Lily. Mommy doted on Lily. She told her stories all the time, fairy tales. But she would mix in things from her life, from her work. She always said the best stories were the true ones." Alistair turned to the little girl, who was watching a duck preen its feathers. "Lily," he said gently, "your Grandma Rosa's story. About the sad king. Can you tell it to me?" Lily turned her big, dark eyes on him. She nodded. "Grandma said there was a king who built a castle of glass so high he could almost touch the sky," she began, her small voice weaving a spell in the quiet park. "He filled it with shiny things, with gold and silver. But he was all alone, and he was sad because he had forgotten the password to the most important room in his kingdom." "What room was that, Lily?" Alistair asked, his breath caught in his throat. "The treasure room," she said. "But the treasure wasn't gold. Grandma said the treasure was remembering." She looked at him, and for a moment, he felt as if he were looking into his father's eyes, full of the same sad, gentle wisdom. She said the king had a key. He just had to find the lock. She said the key was starlight and rust, and the lock was in the heart of the kingdom he had forgotten. The heart of the kingdom he had forgotten. the Ironwood district, the factory. It all came crashing together. His father hadn't been leaving him a clue to a computer. He had been leaving him a map back to himself, back to the values he had discarded. He looked at the child, this impossible messenger, and felt a wave of gratitude so profound it almost brought him to his knees. She had done more than just deliver a password. She had delivered his salvation. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank you." He knew what he had to do. The path forward was no longer about acquisitions and profit margins. It was about redemption. The first step was the hardest. Alistair called an emergency board meeting. He walked into the same room where Lily had first appeared, but he was a different man. The icy, untouchable facade was gone, replaced by a quiet, resolute determination. The board members, already agitated by the week of silence and the stalled Atlas deal, greeted him with hostile glares. Richard Sterling gave him a look that was a mixture of concern and exasperation. "Alistair, what the hell is going on? The market is in a panic. Atlas is about to sue us for breach of contract. You need to close this deal now." Alistair walked to the head of the table but didn't sit down. He looked at each of their faces, faces he had known for years, faces of people who thought just as he had. "The Atlas deal is off," he announced, his voice ringing with clarity. "We're pulling our offer." The room exploded. Shouts of outrage and disbelief echoed off the marble walls. "Are you insane?" one of them yelled. "That's a $10 billion deal. It's the foundation of our 5-year plan." "Our 5-year plan is changing," Alistair said, holding up a hand to quell the noise. He projected an image onto the large screen at the end of the room. It was not a spreadsheet or a growth chart. It was an aerial photograph of the Ironwood district. "This," he said, "is our new focus. The Vance Foundation, which until now has been little more than a tax shelter, is being repurposed. We are launching the Ironwood Revitalization Project." He spent the next hour laying out a vision so radically different from his usual ruthless capitalism that the board was left speechless. He wasn't talking about demolition. He was talking about renewal. He proposed using company funds and the foundation's endowment to restore the old buildings, not tear them down. He outlined a plan to turn the abandoned warehouses into affordable housing, artist lofts, and small business incubators. He wanted to create job training programs for the residents, to build new parks and a state-of-the-art community center. And at the heart of it all, at the center of the revitalized community, was the old Vance & Son factory. "We're not tearing it down," Alistair said, his voice filled with a passion none of them had ever heard from him. "We're restoring it. It will become the Vance Center for Community and Innovation. It will house the job training facilities, a historical museum for the district, and a business accelerator focused on sustainable local enterprise." When he finished, there was a stunned silence. Richard Sterling was the first to speak, his voice low and incredulous. "Alistair, this is philanthropy, not business. Our shareholders will crucify us. We're a publicly traded company, not a charity." "It's a new kind of business, Richard," Alistair replied. "It's an investment in people. It's an investment in a legacy that isn't measured in quarterly earnings. My father tried to do this, in his own way. He tried to save this community, and he failed because the world of business, the world I helped create, crushed him. We're going to prove that you can be successful and still have a soul." The fight was brutal. Several board members threatened to resign and stage a proxy war for control of the company. They called him a traitor to capitalism, a sentimental fool who had lost his nerve. But Alistair held firm. He used every bit of his strategic genius not to dismantle a company, but to save one. He argued not with emotion, but with a new kind of logic. The logic of long-term sustainability, of brand reputation, of creating a new narrative for what a modern corporation could be. In the end, he won. It was a Pyrrhic victory of sorts. He lost two of his oldest allies on the board, and the company's stock took a significant hit. But he had saved its soul. Or perhaps, he had saved his own. The next morning, Alastair drove himself back to the Ironwood district. There was no Maybach, no driver. Just him in a simple sedan, the kind his father used to drive. He parked across the street from a small, run-down apartment building, the address he had for Maria Flores. He sat in the car for a long time, watching kids play stickball in the street, watching neighbors chat on their front stoops. He felt an ache of longing for a sense of community he had never known. He finally got out and walked up the crumbling steps to Maria's apartment. He knocked, and she opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. Lily was right behind her, peering around her mother's legs. "Mr. Vance?" Maria stammered. "What are you doing here?" "I came to offer you a job, Maria," he said, "and to ask for your help." He explained his plan, the revitalization project. He told her he wanted to form a community advisory board to help guide the project, to ensure it served the real needs of the residents, and he wanted her to be on it. "Me?" she asked, astonished. "But I am just a cleaner. What do I know?" "You know this community," Alastair said. "You know what it's like to live here, to raise a child here. That knowledge is more valuable to me right now than a dozen MBAs. I want you to be the voice for the people who live here." He then looked down at Lily. "And I have another proposal," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "When we rebuild my father's old factory, we're going to have a new park next to it. I was thinking of calling it Starlight Park. And I'd like to commission its first official watchkeeper, someone to make sure we never forget to look up." Lily's face broke into a radiant smile, the first time he had seen her express such open joy. It was a light that seemed to fill the dim hallway. Maria's eyes welled with tears as she finally understood. This man wasn't here to threaten them or to buy their silence. He was here to offer them a future. She accepted his offer. And so began the most challenging and rewarding chapter of Alastair Vance's life. The work was slow, difficult, and fraught with challenges. There was bureaucracy, skepticism from the community he was trying to help, and constant pressure from his shareholders. But for the first time, Alastair was engaged in work that felt real. He spent more time in the Ironwood district than he did in Vance Tower. He traded his bespoke suits for jeans and hard hats. He learned the names of the residents, listened to their stories, and found himself humbled by their resilience and spirit. He also found the old computer. It was still in the factory office, covered in a thick layer of dust. He booted it up, the machine groaning to life after decades of silence. He typed in the password, "Starlight and Rust," and it opened. It was a time capsule. It contained his father's journals, filled with his hopes and dreams for the factory and the community. It had letters he had written to Alastair but never sent. Letters filled with love, pride, and a desperate plea for his son to not lose his heart in the pursuit of success. Alastair sat in the dusty office for hours, reading his father's words, and he wept. He wept for the years he had wasted, for the misunderstandings that had separated them, for the love he had never properly acknowledged. He was the sad king, and the treasure he had unlocked was the memory of his father's love. He learned that his father had been secretly funding the local soup kitchen and had been trying to set up a scholarship fund for the district's children before he fell ill. Alastair used the Vance Foundation to resurrect and expand every single one of his father's charitable projects. The project took 2 years to complete. The Ironwood district was transformed. It was still the same neighborhood, with the same people and the same history, but now it was filled with hope. The old buildings shone with new life. The streets were clean and safe, and at its heart stood the Vance Center for Community and Innovation, a testament to what was possible when capital was guided by compassion. On the day of the dedication ceremony, the whole community turned out. The sun was shining, and the air was filled with music and laughter. Alistair stood on the stage, not as a conquering billionaire, but as a member of the community. He looked out at the crowd and saw Maria Flores, no longer a timid cleaner, but a confident community leader, standing with the other members of the advisory board. And beside her, he saw Lily, holding a new teddy bear, her eyes shining with pride. His speech was short. He spoke of his father, of second chances, and of the importance of remembering where you came from. He spoke of how a little girl with a story had reminded him of a password he had forgotten, and in doing so, had shown him the way home. Later that evening, after the crowds had gone home, Alistair stood with Maria and Lily in the newly dedicated Starlight Park. It was on the exact spot where the factory's old, grimy skylight used to be. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Lily pointed up. "Look," she whispered. "Starlight." Alistair looked up at the infinite expanse. Then he looked down at the rich, dark earth of the park, at the sturdy new benches and the young trees that had been planted. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He put his arm around Lily's shoulders. Starlight, and not a speck of rust in sight. He was no longer the sad king. He was just a son who had finally understood his father's legacy. He had found the treasure. He was home. The journey had been arduous, a complete tearing down and rebuilding of his own identity. In the months that followed the board meeting, Alistair felt as if he were learning to walk again. The language of his life had been profit, leverage, and market share. Now he had to learn a new vocabulary: sustainability, equity, and community trust. It was a humbling and often frustrating process. There were days when the old Alistair, the ruthless predator, would rear his head. He would grow impatient with the slow pace of community meetings, with the endless debates over zoning variants and public art installations. He would feel the primal urge to simply write a check, to use his immense wealth to steamroll the obstacles and impose his will. But each time that urge arose, he would think of Lily's clear, steady gaze. He would think of the sad king, alone in his glass castle. And he would force himself to slow down, to listen, to collaborate. His relationship with Maria Flores deepened into a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect. She became his guide to the soul of Ironwood. She took him to the church basement soup kitchen, where he spent an afternoon serving meals. The simple act of ladling stew into a bowl for a grateful stranger affecting him more than any multi-billion-dollar deal ever had. She introduced him to Mr. Henderson, a retired auto worker who ran a small, unofficial library out of his garage, and Alistair quietly funded its expansion into a full-fledged community resource. He learned that the graffiti he had once seen as urban blight was, in fact, vibrant street art, and he commissioned the local artist to create murals on the restored buildings. Maria never let him forget who he was doing this for. When a subcontractor tried to cut corners by using cheaper, non-union labor, it was Maria who brought the workers' complaints to him. The old Alistair would have applauded the cost-saving measure. The new Alistair flew into a rage, fired the subcontractor on the spot, and hired the local union crew at double the rate, personally apologizing to them for the slight. His actions began to speak louder than his money. The residents of Ironwood, initially suspicious of the billionaire who had planned to bulldoze their homes, began to see him not as a developer, but as an ally. They started calling him by his first name. They would stop him on the street to share an idea or a concern. He was no longer an alien in a Maybach. He was a part of the neighborhood's fabric. Richard Sterling, his COO, watched the transformation with a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. He had been one of the most vocal opponents of Alastair's new direction. But as the months wore on, he started to see the method in what he had once called madness. The press, initially critical of the stock drop and the abandoned Atlas deal, began to run glowing stories about the Ironwood project. Vance Industries, once seen as a corporate predator, was being hailed as a pioneer of compassionate capitalism. Young, talented graduates were clamoring to work for the company, not for the high salaries, but for the sense of purpose. The company's brand value was soaring. "I don't understand it," Richard confessed to Alastair one day as they reviewed the plans for the new Vance Center. "We abandoned the most profitable deal in our history for this, and somehow the company is stronger than ever." "That's because we were measuring the wrong thing, Richard," Alastair said, looking at a blueprint for a daycare facility that would be included in the center. "We were measuring profit. We should have been measuring value. What we're building here has real, lasting value, and people recognize that." The work on the factory itself was a personal pilgrimage for Alastair. He insisted on being involved in every detail of its restoration. He walked the dusty floors where his father had walked, touching the old, silent machinery. He found a faded height chart penciled on a wall in the office, marking his growth from age 6 to 12. He stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the final mark, a tangible connection to a past he had tried to erase. The discovery of his father's unsent letters was the true turning point. He took the old computer back to his penthouse and spent a week doing nothing but reading his father's words. He learned of his father's pride in his academic achievements, his worries about his growing hardness, his deep, abiding love. One letter, written just after Alastair had closed his first major deal by liquidating a smaller, family-owned competitor, was particularly painful to read. "I saw the news today, Ali," Arthur had written. "I know I should be proud of your success. You are brilliant, my son. A king. But I worry about your heart. That company we bought, it was a lot like mine. I knew the founder, a good man. He had to lay off 50 people who had worked for him for decades. I hope you remember to look at the stars today, son. Don't let the rust get to you." Alastair had to stop reading, the words blurring through his tears. He had seen that layoff as a footnote, a necessary casualty of business. He had never once thought of the human cost. He had let the rust consume him. It was after reading those letters that he fully committed to his father's hidden philanthropic work. He found the records of the scholarship fund his father had dreamed of. It was to be named the Starlight Scholarship, intended for underprivileged children from the Ironwood district. Alastair endowed it with $100 million from his personal fortune. The first recipient, he decided, would be Lily Flores. He offered to pay for her entire education, from elementary school through to any university she chose. Maria wept when he told her, but Lily, with her usual serene wisdom, simply took his hand and said, "Thank you, Mr. King." The project was not without its villains. A rival developer, a man named Marcus Thorne, who was every bit as ruthless as the old Alastair, saw the Ironwood project as a threat. Thorne had been buying up surrounding properties, expecting to profit from the demolition and the new tech campus. Alastair's reversal had cost him millions. Thorne launched a smear campaign, planting stories in the press that the project was a vanity project, a financial black hole that would bankrupt Vance Industries. He tried to organize a shareholder revolt. For a moment, it looked like he might succeed. The stock wavered, and the board grew nervous again. Alastair, however, was no longer just a businessman. He was a man fighting for his soul. He didn't fight Thorne in the financial pages. He fought him on the ground. He organized a community festival in Ironwood, inviting the press and his shareholders to see the progress for themselves. They saw the restored buildings. They met the grateful residents. They heard the stories of lives being changed. They saw Lily Flores cut the ribbon on the new Mr. Henderson's library. Thorne's narrative of a failing vanity project crumbled in the face of the vibrant, hopeful reality. The shareholder revolt fizzled out. The dedication ceremony for the Vance Center in Starlight Park marked the culmination of the 2-year journey. As Alistair stood on that stage, he felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that $10 billion could never have bought. He saw his father's dream not just realized, but amplified beyond anything Arthur could have imagined. In the crowd, he saw Richard Sterling, his old friend, smiling and applauding, a convert to the new way of thinking. He saw Maria, strong and confident, a leader in her own right. And he saw Lily, the small girl who had started it all. After the ceremony, in the quiet of the new park, as they watched the stars come out, Lily gave him a small, wrapped gift. He opened it. It was a snow globe. Inside, a tiny replica of Vance Tower stood tall. But when he shook it, the snow that swirled around it wasn't white flakes, but tiny, glittering golden stars. "So you never forget," Lily said. Alistair hugged her, holding the small glass sphere as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He had spent his life building a castle of glass, but a little girl had taught him how to put the stars inside it. The rust was gone. The Sad King was finally home. And his reign, a reign of compassion and hope, was just beginning.